This is Bannon the day before January 6th. This is January 5th.
All hell is going to break loose tomorrow.
And it has to be vindicated to save our republic.
We will win this fight, or America will step off into 1,000 years of darkness.
The battle cries wrapped in their delusional lies about a stolen election. Steve Bannon, whose Twitter and YouTube channels were removed for rhetoric like this,
I'd put the heads on pikes.
Spent weeks on a podcast he calls The War Room, comparing the Republicans' fight to overturn a legitimate election to historic periods in the American Revolution and World War II.
I've met so many people through my life said, man, if I was a revolution, I would be with Washington and Trenton. Well, you know, this is for your time in history.
Ominously, the day before the siege.
It's not going to happen like you think it's going to happen, okay? It's going to be quite extraordinarily different. And all I can say is strap in. You have made this happen, and tomorrow it's game day.
I mean, what? How is it possible that we can't hold that man accountable for foreknowledge of a domestic terrorist attack upon the seat of government in this United States of America, in this here country? How is that possible? How is that possible? Well, this is what I was telling you. It gets very complex from here. So last night, as you know, they had their little business meeting at the January 6th Select Committee, and they voted out of the Select Committee unanimously to issue a contempt citation for Bannon. All right. So then the next step was it had to go to the Rules Committee. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Had to go to the Rules Committee, and it did do that today. And the Rules Committee was divided. Honestly, they were divided right along party lines. So that means there are more Democrats than Republicans. We won. And by we, I mean people who want to uphold the law and punish domestic terrorists and those who aid and abet them and plan, for terrorist attacks on the U.S. Capitol. Okay, so that was a divided vote. And now tomorrow it goes to the whole entire floor of the House. And of course, we have the majority there, and that will come right down party lines as well, but it will pass, and there will be a contempt citation, which then goes to a different branch of government. And this is the dilemma, right? That the House doesn't enforce its own rules or laws is very interesting to me. But that instead, the House has to rely on another branch of government. And so it now goes to the executive branch, basically. It goes to the Department of Justice, and it goes to the D.C. Attorney General. That's where it goes. And those lawyers will then be asked if they think convening a grand jury to hear evidence against this man is called for, right? And we don't know the answer. We don't know what Merrick Garland will do. We don't know what the D.C. AG will do. We have no idea. We don't know. We don't know. My money is on, yes, they'll put it into a grand jury scenario. But, then you're talking about presenting evidence, and you're talking about getting an indictment. And then if you do get the indictment, then what? Well, then it goes to a court, and the court puts it on a calendar for a trial. You know how long that's going to take? Do you? So if you're with me on everything I just said, you probably stopped and your mind said, you're right. Why doesn't the House enforce its own subpoenas? Why don't they? And the only tool they have to do that is this idea that we've talked about before. It's called inherent contempt. It is the way that Congress was given to enforce its own subpoenas, to enforce its own contempt citations, to enforce its own rules. Inherent contempt. And that would then trigger events, action. Things would actually happen. What would actually happen, Rand? Oh, it's real simple. So you'd make a phone call after the House passed by a majority to hold Bannon in contempt of Congress because he was involved in an attempted coup, because he was involved in seditious behavior, because he was involved in a domestic terrorist act, because he had foreknowledge of it at the very least, and at the very most, he helped organize it. And the sergeant at arms in the House of Representatives would then go to Bannon's abode, and they would arrest him, or he would arrest Steve Bannon. And Bannon would then be placed in a little jail underneath the House of Representatives up there on Capitol Hill and held until he agreed to comply with the subpoena. Now, that hasn't been done in about 80 years, but let me throw a little stat at you in addition to the 80-year inherent contempt, use of that power that Congress actually has. Oh, that's so 2017, Ran. Yeah, I get it. It's an older tactic, but it's still there. It's available. The other stat I want you to have in your craw, in your head, in your arsenal is nobody has been held in contempt of Congress in 40 years. You understand that? In 40 years. Now, they threatened Bill Barr with contempt. They threatened Mike Pompeo with contempt. And so they think, when Bill Barr came and showed up and decided he would testify, and when Pompeo came and showed up and said he would testify, that this was proof that Congress had power to force people, to compel people to testify. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. They just decided that they would come up and play with you. And that's what they did. They played their little game. Now, the other thing you need to know is that Steve Bannon is not free to not show up. He's not free to not show up. If Steve Bannon wants to show up and invoke a privilege, whether it be executive privilege, which is a hoot, that is a laugh, that is a farce, or if Steve Bannon wants to take the fifth, he's allowed to do either of those two things, but he has to show up and do them. He can't just sit it out. The reason why Steve Bannon is so smug is because he believes that Congress will never, ever enforce its own subpoenas. And that might be true. And that would be bad. That would be bad. So we have to wait now and see if Congress is sufficiently motivated by the crime of insurrection, by the crime of domestic terrorism, by the crime of seditious behavior, by the crimes that Roger Stone and Gosar and Biggs and Bannon and Trump all engaged in. If the nature of the terrorist act, if the nature of the attack, if the nature of the trying to overthrow our government thing is severe enough to make them say, all right, all bets are off, we're going to invoke inherent contempt. We've never seen this before. We've never had, this is a unique situation, a uniquely violent, unconstitutional situation. We have never been confronted, and we must use our awesome power to compel. Don't have time to listen to the live show? Want to hear more on your schedule? Go to RandiRhodes.com and buy a stinking podcast.